Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Reading. It's like being completely present and completely absent at the same time.
Hello, welcome to Sundaku, the podcast for readers with a big pile of books next to their bed. I'm Annie Haswell.
And I'm Sarah Martin.
Sarah, what are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading a new book. I've just picked it up this week and I don't really know much about it. It's called Australian Gospel. It's written by a guy called Lech Blaine, and it's the story of his mother and his mother's family, the Blaines, and their sort of schism with this other couple, the Shelleys. And it sort of tells their stories through time in Australia. But it's a narrative non-fiction. So it's telling this story of these two people, obviously one connected to the author, who are travelling through Australian life, you know, through the 50s, and sort of dips a bit into their history before that and how they came to meet one another. But one couple, the Shelleys, seem to be quite zealous hippies, but, you know, sort of enlightened hippies who are out preaching the word of God. And the Blaines, he's a bit of a gambler. She's very sort of quiet and conservative, and it's sort of looking at their life as a couple, but it's implying there's going to be a meeting and a clash of these two families over time. And so I'm sort of on tenterhooks waiting to find out what happens. But I'm loving it because I've gone in blind and the writing is fascinating and it's just got its hooks into me straight away.
And it's a tell-all about two families who really exist.
Who really exist.
Always a dangerous thing to do, isn't it?
I know.
Ruins Christmas.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily need to. I think there are people who probably get wiped out in this, but I'll tell you more later.
Okay.
How about you? What are you reading?
Oh, look, so many things. I don't know where to start, but I mean, by the time anyone's listening to this, it will be well over, but I've been embroiled in the Adelaide Writers' Festival, everybody's favourite writers' festival in Australia. And it's glorious down there. And you just realise how many people read. Like, you cannot get into the book tent, and they're all buying too. So listening and buying and fighting over chairs, and it's quite extraordinary. But it is, like, heartening to know how much people love books, I suppose.
It's such a glorious setting there. I'm very jealous because my schedule isn't really letting me get there very much. But if you haven't made it to Adelaide for Writers' Week and are wondering, just picture lush grass, beautiful big trees, and just this gorgeous fresh breeze running through the centre of Adelaide with the river in the distance, and you can hear the birds, and you've got different stages with people talking, and it's just glorious. You can lie on the grass, you can sit on a chair, but just soaking it up is just one of the biggest thrills of the year.
Well, I've never seen so many people at it as this year, and I'm sure they're coming from interstate. So, yeah, I think it's kind of famous.
All free.
And it's free. Now, you've got an author for us today.
I do. I had a chat with Candice Fox. Now, many people who love Australian thrillers would know Candice's writing. She is just one of those queens of fast-paced, thrilling, you know, by the seat of your pants, moving forward all the time, writing. And so I've had a fabulous chat with her about her latest book, The High Wire.
And I'm going to reflect on the fine tradition of the literary journal. And believe me, if you're a writer wanting to get your writing out there, these are very valuable little publications and the best place to start. They've got a long history. The first one was in France in 1684. And what it is about them, they come out regularly. They accept all manner of writing, from short stories to poetry to reviews, whatever. And they're kind of like the feelers into the future of where writing's at any given time. So today we'll meet the editor of a new literary journal that's coming out in South Australia called Splinter.
So as I said before, Candice Fox is just so great at writing edge of your seat type of thrilling stories. This latest one, Highwire, is set out in the backlots of Australia, and she's come up with this idea that there is a route through the bush, off all of the roads, called the Highwire, and it's the road that the criminals use, that people can get lost on, that you've just got to know the little markers to find your way through, and it's where people do deals and where people get killed. It's the underbelly of the outback. She has set up this story where you've just got people who are out there, suddenly there's a fire in the middle of the bush, a car's on fire, and this gentleman, Harvey, turns up, has a look, and the game begins. And you are, from that moment, you are on the ride and you don't let go. I spoke with Candice about what it was that appealed to her about writing crime, and she said it's always been a part of her life.
I grew up in a very scrappy area of Bankstown, and most of my friends, their parents were doing drug deals, or they had the old hydroponic set up, in their laundry. My dad worked at a Sydney prison for about 30 years, so he was bringing home all of his prison stories to my mother, and the two of them had no tact whatsoever, so I was hearing all of those grisly stories from very, very young of prisoners killing each other or killing themselves or what they were in for. And also my mum fostered 155 kids as I was growing up, so every single one of those kids had their own crime story, and she would tell us them all. She would say, that kid's parents have been arrested for armed robbery, and let's go and look at the bank that they held up, and all this kind of stuff. People grew up with fairy tales or the Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter or whatever. I grew up with that kind of thing. That's just what makes story for me.
That's a pretty good bed to build everything up from, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And it's just where my interest lies. And, if I'm reading a book and nobody's dead by about 10,000 words in, I'm thinking, why do I care about this? My tastes are very extreme.
And do you draw your characters from those stories?
Yeah, sometimes I do. It depends who I'm writing about. Sometimes I try to imagine what it would be like for the police to bust into your house one day while you're doing the washing up, and they say, we think your husband is a serial killer and we're going to search the house now. And, it's just something that would come out of nowhere and upend your entire existence. So sometimes I see something in the news and I think about that and I think, what would that be like? I want to explore that moment by moment and just take a character through that and think about who she is and how she would deal with that and how she grew up and what tools she has for dealing with this shock. Or other times I do base characters on real people. I had a crew of builders in my backyard who were building a deck for me, and they were so deliciously, they're just kind of oozing with criminality, really. They were dodgy as hell, and I just found them so wonderfully inspiring. And so I used them to fuel the characters in a book I wrote called Devil's Kitchen. But once people find out you're a writer, they're just so eager to tell you things. So I hear the most extraordinary stories just getting around in my life. I know people who are billionaires and I know people who are homeless, and I get around with all walks of life just in my life.
And all of them are willing to divulge some sort of deep and dirty stories from their lives.
Oh, they are. Every single Uber driver that I have ever had has had an idea for a novel. Every single one. And as soon as I say, what do you do? And I say a novelist, they go, oh, my God, I have this great story. Let me tell you all about it. You don't have to look far. But it's just weeding through that and finding stuff that is going to entertain the masses, because sometimes something will be fascinating to me. And I think that historical novelists find this a lot. You do the research and you're like, wow, potatoes were really important to the uprising of Protestantism. And nobody cares about that. What they care about is the character who's dealing with the potato shortage or whatever it is that you're writing about. You can't fuel all that evidence in there sometimes. So sometimes I find out that the cops do things in a particular way and they have 7 different forms and this is the form that they need to use and this is how you access it. And I think I can't put any of that in. I can't have my characters wait for 2 weeks for DNA results to come back because the killer's going to kill somebody in that time. So let's just say it was 2 hours.
You just set up unreasonable expectations from people on how fast this stuff can work.
That's right. It's a nice big balance. My first novel ever published is called Hades. It's about this guy running around Sydney stealing people's body parts, which is pretty unrealistic. So I had to have a really realistic guy solving that crime, a very ordinary man who is very believable, because otherwise it would have been too much. So you balance it all out.
Your latest book, Highwire, the lead character, Harvey Buck, is an ex-military.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
So when you're trying to work out the details of their lives, you've got your character formed as an idea, but do you have to do a lot of research in that sort of detail and minutiae that you then cut out, but just so that you've got it as a bed for your knowledge?
Sometimes you can just flub it or be vague enough. I find myself Googling the rank structure of both the military and different police, in the US and both here and in different states a lot to figure out what's the difference between a senior constable and a detective and all this kind of stuff. But there's nothing more joyous than sitting down with somebody who really was in Afghanistan and who can tell you this is what it's like and this was what we used to do, and no, they don't have this. This is a myth, that's not a myth. That's just wonderful because they're going to drop something on you that you couldn't possibly imagine. Like I went to New York to find out about the firefighters, and I walked from firehouse to firehouse in New York, all around Manhattan, trying to find firefighters who would speak to me for that novel. And when I did, they told me the most amazing things. And, I would say to them, what's the stupidest fire you've ever attended? What is the most amazing story? And it was coming out and coming out and coming out. They had endless amounts of stories, and I couldn't possibly have made them up.
And perhaps when you conjure things up in your mind, you think, gee, that's a bit too ridiculous. It seems like it couldn't be possible. But then you realise, the weird things are real.
They are. I know Michael Connolly because I run into him at all different things, and he told me this amazing story where he wanted to have this real-life incident put into a novel, and they wouldn't let him have it because it sounded so unrealistic. It was the cops turned up to a house in L.A. and knocked on the door, and a voice inside said, "Come in." And so they came in, and they found drugs everywhere, just spread out everywhere in piles of cash in this obvious drug house. And the person who had said, "Come in," wasn't a person at all. It was a parrot. And he wanted to use that because that really did happen and put it in a novel. And his editor said, no one's ever going to believe that. I've had instances as well where I've said to my editors and publishers, this comes from a real case. And there are so many strange things that happen. When I'm teaching writing, I always say, look for the tiny little news stories that are just off to the side, and it's just a very small story, and then go down that rabbit hole. I use this example of there was a medical forensic truck that was left parked in a car park overnight at a medical research facility, and somebody thought, I think I'll see if that truck is open. They hopped the fence and went and robbed the truck, and they took a heavy box. Obviously, they didn't read the label on the side, which said exempt human specimen, and it was 8 heads that they stole, 8 human heads, and they never actually recovered those heads. And so I use that as a writing exercise to say to people, let's try to think about the different perspectives that we could write this story from. The thief or the guy who left the truck parked there, or one of the heads, or the family members of one of the people whose head was stolen. These extraordinary stories, but you have to sift through the more ordinary stories to find them.
Your writing practice sounds like it's interesting. It sounds like the antithesis of an author who often shuts themselves away for a big period of time, or is it just a balance for you?
I never shut myself away. Writing for me has always been something that I have to squeeze into my everyday life. You know, as a kid, I was writing. I started writing full-size novels when I was 12. So that meant squeezing that writing time in, you know, because my mum had 6 kids and then she was allowed to have 6 more foster kids. And so there was a lot of parenting on my part because it's just not possible for one person. You know, she was a single mum for a lot of that to parent all 12. So I had something like 20 minutes after school to come home and do some writing. So I always just squeezed it in. So these days I'm on book tour and I'm in the hotel. So I wake up early, do some writing in the dining area, and then I go and I do my gig and FaceTime my family, do a little bit more writing there at night. And I do musical chairs at home. I go up to the local cafe, I'm writing in my office, I'm writing on the porch, I'm seeing someone for lunch, so I go to the restaurant early, do some writing. So I'm just out there in the world.
It feels like it works as long as you can carve out the time.
And, you know, I just live a life where I do weird things anyway that interest me and they become inspiring. Like in 2018, I met a serial killer because it occurred to me that I had never met a killer before. Like I'd seen them. When I was a kid, Dad's work events were always at the local prison. So we would go there. If it was Garth Christmas or whatever, bring your family. They shut down the whole prison. And us kids would just be able to run around. We'd run around long day. And so I was looking in the windows at murderers. But as an adult writing about murderers, I'd never actually met one. And it just seemed fraudulent. So I found a serial killer who interested me on death row in San Quentin. And I wrote to him and I said, can I come visit and ask you some questions? Because, to be frank, you're just about the worst person I've ever heard of in my life. And he said, yeah, sure. What else is he doing? So I talked to him for about 2 years, and then he died. And he taught me about psychopaths. He taught me what they're really like. And I'm far less interested in them now. I'm more interested in ordinary people who are pushed to the edge and they snap. And I think, you know, where is that line for you, that you would cross that line into criminality? Because that line is different for everyone. And then my husband said to me, we were doing our honeymoon in the US because we both love the US, and we were driving up the East Coast from the Florida Keys all the way up to Maine. And he said, what do you want to do on that stretch? And I said, there are so many true crime locations to visit, like body dumping sites and the sites of famous shootings, and can we go on a big murder tour? And he's like, yeah, sure, as long as we can fit in the occasional dive bar and, you know, things that he wanted to do. He's a very understanding man, my husband.
I mean, the thing is, how else do you make it something that you can write by feel without soaking yourself in it, really? I mean, that's the reality.
You don't want to be someone who is sitting at home Googling things and reading books, because criminals aren't writing books. The real criminals are out there doing stuff. So you got to see them and watch them and interact with them and understand their language and hear their stories. And, you know, the cops, it's the same thing again. Like, these characters, they're not writing the books. I could imitate the work of other crime fiction authors, but what I'm doing is imitating fiction. I want to imitate life. So you got to get out there and live. I've also just stopped being embarrassed to ask these questions, because every now and then somebody will say, geez, that's a little bit sick, isn't it? And I go, well, I'm a crime writer. What do you want?
Have you ever got into a situation when you're out in the real world and you're putting yourself in positions where you are watching and learning and probably getting to that edgier part of things? Have you been at a point where you've gone, oh, I've possibly put myself into somewhere precarious here?
Yeah, it's hard. You know, interacting with fans and things sometimes, if a reader has read all of my books and they've listened to all of my interviews, and some of these people come to every single one of my talks, they get the idea that maybe we're friends, but we're not. What you're doing is interacting with a public version of me. So then they sort of try to come into my personal life through a lot of messaging or emailing or visits or following me to my car. And that's happened a few times. So that's always dangerous because I have to walk it back then. The type of people that I'm dealing with sometimes with some of this research, you know, it does get a little bit worrying. And, there's just physically dangerous stuff. Like, I'm in New York, I'm walking through Harlem in the middle of the night. I had dinner with a firefighter, and he was like, "Are you sure you don't want me to walk you to the subway?" And I was like, no, it's fine. This is Harlem, but it's not Harlem in the 80s. And then I was walking through Harlem, and I was like, oh, my God, it is actually still quite dangerous here. Oh, I should have taken the escort. But, you just do what you can. You take the right precautions. And I try to do things like my daughter, Violet, is 5. So I do talk about Violet, but nobody knows what she looks like. Nobody knows where we live. Yeah.
The feedback that I'm seeing quite a lot with Highwire, which is fabulous, by the way, is
thank you.
Readers are really happy to have something back in Australia again.
Mm.
I mean, you've written Australian-based novels. You've written a lot of US-based novels. What prompted you to bring it back home?
I had just written a very American novel. Like, it was firefighters, it was September 11, it was in New York, the FBI was involved, and it was very American. And so I think I got that out of my system a little bit. And just, we are having like a huge rural crime wave in Australia, and Germany loves the rural Australian crime as well. And it's just everywhere, and everyone's talking about it, and it's hot, hot, hot. So that just naturally led me to think, well, if I was going to do an Outback thing, it was sort of like a challenge. It was like, how would I make it Candice Foxy self? And I think it's different to all of those Outback ones that are happening at the moment. It's very high octane, intense, multiple perspectives, it's minute by minute ticking clock stuff, whereas Outback rural noir books that are so hot right now tend to be mysteries that are beautiful, and they're slowly unfolding, and the tension is gently rising all the time. But I'm writing another one set in Australia at the moment. Then I might go back to the US after that, because I just love America. I get over there once a year for the big writers' festivals, and I just love that place.
There's lots of stories and scenes to uncover, and sometimes you go to a place that's not your familiar, you see things differently, and so you pick up on different ideas of stories and different senses of landscape that you can't always get when it's like you're wearing that coat already.
Yeah, for sure. It's just a place that is terrible as it is wonderful, and as horrifying as it is beautiful. It's all mixed together there. It's all on top of each other. Los Angeles in particular, it's just things smashed together that don't belong. You've got coyotes running around in the middle of the city, and you've got celebrities, walking amongst desperate homeless people, and, huge, beautiful billboards about these movies, and then there's these homeless camps and these tiny little dive bars, and it's all smashed together. That's just wonderful.
Bringing it back to Australia and to Highwire, been living in this very high-octane world that you created. Is the high wire a thing? Can you explain for listeners what the concept of the high wire is?
I came up with this concept, but I think that it's probably real. I mean, it makes sense. It's a secret outback road that really only bad people know about, and it crosses the country in a direct diagonal. You could say it's the fastest way to get from Sydney to Broome, diagonally, straight across the middle of the country. But you can't just wing it and drive across country. It's a road that would be used by drug smugglers and long-haul truckers trying to take a shortcut, and people dumping bodies, and they have to move around all the time because police will enter an area, or a new satellite will be watching a certain area. So it's a fluid kind of road that moves, and you only know you're on it because there are certain symbols. So there might be a broken down truck with an arrow spray painted on the side, and that's how you know you're on it. And if you don't see a sign for a while, you have to go back because you're like, I thought I was on it, but I'm not. So Harvey Buck is a character. He's on this road. He's trying to get as fast as he can from the Alice Springs area to Sydney. So he joins the high wire to just do a sort of a straight diagonal shot. And he's driving through the outback, and he runs into Claire Holland, who has broken down. But her story about why she's there doesn't make a lot of sense. But he picks her up anyway because it's a dangerous area and doesn't want to leave her there. And he's a bit of a hero as a person. So then the two of them get tangled up in a nightmare scenario when they're abducted about 15 minutes later by two guys who are waiting for them on the high wire. It's a concept that I had, but I think it's very believable. And I explained it to Violet, she's 5. She said, "What's your new book about?" So it's about this outback road, and it's used by criminals to move things as fast as they can across Australia. It's a scary old road that only bad people use. And she said, "Can we go there?" Sure, babe.
She sounds great. I'll tell you what.
Fun. Yeah.
It's that thing about it has the power of Wolf Creek in that it's a place, it creates a tone around the landscape where it charts that space in between it being not necessarily a real thing, but entirely possible.
I say in the novel, it's like space. No one will hear you scream. No one's coming for you. Even if you called the police and pinpointed your location, no one is getting to you for 45 minutes. It's like being in the middle of the sea. And that's extraordinary because people venture out there. They go gold fossicking and they go cross-country tours. It's just ripe for crime stories for somebody waiting for them to come out there into space and be vulnerable to whoever's there. I just love it as a concept. And the fact that all of these Aussies are saying to me, "Is it real? Is it a real road?" Like, it's not foreign readers who are saying that. It's Aussies because we believe it, because we know all those stories about Azaria Chamberlain and Peter Falconio and those 2 gold miners. One of them was found down a mine shaft and one of them they've never seen her again. So we know these stories from our childhood about people going out there and being...
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Never seen again.
And that's Candice Fox speaking about her latest novel, High Wire, which is published by Penguin.
Now let's find out about a new literary journal recently launched in Adelaide. Taking you now to that launch and a reading from a short story by Hossein Asghari. It's called I'm Afraid of Forgetting So Many Things, and it's being read here by his friend Gillian.
His father walks into the kitchen. "Look what I found." He waves a notebook. "Sit. I'm about to bring tea." His father places a notebook on the kitchen table and sits with a groan. "There's so much stuff in this. Our oldest son..." He falters and scratches the back of his left hand. "Saeed," his mother says, places the teacups on the kitchen table and sits opposite his father. "Yes, Saeed," he laughs shyly. "I forget everything these days." "It's okay, Babajan," he says. "We all forget things." "Saeed, he's such a good boy. I was just going through the notebook and there were a few lines about the time when I visited him in Australia," his mother interferes. "Australia? Where is Australia?" "It's a country, a continent in the southern hemisphere," he says. "Is it far?" "Yes, Babajan, very far." "Now I remember, he was a professor there." "He isn't a professor," his mother says. "When I was a professor at the University of Tehran..." "You were never a professor. You did your bachelor's degree at the University of Tehran. You were a high school teacher for 30 years in Mashhad." He wants to ask his mother not to correct his father anymore, to tell her that his father needs to fill in the gaps in his mind to prevent his world from crumbling down.
A snippet from a story called I'm Afraid of Forgetting So Many Things by Hossein Asghari. And that's just one of the many and varied writings in the first edition of South Australia's newly launched journal, Splinter. Farin Foster is the editor.
So the idea of Splinter really is to create, I guess, a gathering point for literary industry in South Australia, but also a platform where great South Australian writers can be published alongside great international and national writers, where they belong. It can be pretty hard, I think, for South Australian writers to feel their way into the East Coast literary industry. It feels like it's a long way away, even though Melbourne's a 1 hour flight away. So hopefully Splinter brings that a bit closer for everyone. And also I just really wanted it to be like a fun read. I think sometimes, and there's space for all kinds of literary journals in Australia, but sometimes they can be pretty intimidating. And I just wanted to create something that was intellectually rigorous, but also accessible and maybe made you laugh a little bit reading it.
So when you say it helps South Australian writers be alongside national and international writers, how do you make that work within the journal?
Yeah, so our very practical, boring answer is we have a quota. So I always publish at least 25% South Australian writers. It was more than that in the first issue because there was, more excellent writing from South Australia that we wanted to publish. But that's our baseline. We have readers internationally and around Australia. It's not an exclusively South Australian journal, but it's important that we are putting something in place to make sure South Australians are getting a go.
Give me an idea of the range of kind of material. You say you have a quota in terms of who is writing, but what about the range of ideas? I notice you've got poetry, you've got some very interesting page layouts and punctuation in some of the pieces. So do you have a kind of idea of where things begin and where they end?
Genre-wise, you mean? Yeah. So, at the very highest level, we do non-fiction, fiction, and poetry, which is, basically another way of saying everything. We have memoir, we have reportage, we have criticism, fiction, and poetry. But I think the uniting idea is we always want something that has a little bit of a sense of slipperiness or blurriness around reality. We want people who are testing the bounds of kind of where reality and perception ends, pushing readers into sort of strange, maybe absurd spaces, and opening people's worlds up a little bit.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting near future fiction piece in the journal, which I actually... Because we were coming out in November 2024, I was looking for something that reflected on the US elections. When we were going to print, I didn't know who had won, but I knew that we needed to somehow engage with the conversation, I guess you would say diplomatically, in the United States. So there's a piece in there by Frank Marazza, which is set in a world where basically YouTubers hold a lot more power than they do currently, and a YouTuber suggests to their followers that the best way to deal with gun violence is for anti-gun activists to shoot all the pro-gun people. And I was really interested in this story because it had the sense of how extreme and strange rhetoric had gotten in the United States, but it was just past the reality that we're currently living in. So it pushed something really true to its logical extreme.
And very frightening too.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you get a sense, because you would be looking at new writing all the time, do you get a sense of what the preoccupations are? Like I see a lot of dystopia because I think everybody's scared and doesn't really know where things are heading.
Absolutely. Really interestingly, I'm in the middle of reading submissions for issue 2 at the moment, and there's been a big swing. So issue 1 submissions, there was a lot of grief, there was a lot of near future dystopic writing. There was also a reasonable amount of violence, but I think we're seeing a lot of violence in places like Gaza, Ukraine, but writers had refracted that violence into maybe intimate partner relationships and things like that in issue 1. Issue 2, huge amount of stories set in space. Everybody's taken their story to space. It's like all the writers gave up on Earth and they've just set all their fiction in space. It's really amazing.
That's really interesting, especially when you look at Orbital, which won the Booker Prize, and that sense that, we move our view of the world. It's had to move outwards.
Yes, shifting that perspective, I guess, to look back on Earth. And, I imagine that the thought of the writers is similar to Orbital, that if we can see the Earth in a more clear-eyed way, we might still be able to save it. Optimistic. But also there's just a lot of stuff. Like, I think on Friday I read 2 romances that were set on Mars. for like no discernible reason, to be honest.
Do they deal with the problems of actually living on Mars?
No, which was a shame.
So what about funding? How do you fund something like this?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. I was hired by Writers SA, who's the publisher of Splinter, and the Writers SA had gone out and done what seems like quite a miraculous thing and gotten all 3 South Australian universities to support the journal. So the University of South Australia, Flinders University and the University of Adelaide are all funders of Splinter, and we also have funding from Arts South Australia. So we've got 4 issues funded, and then we're back in the grant application cycle and all back talking to partners and things like that. But I think it's a rare privilege to be hired by a literary journal that has these resources to start itself, rather than having to build up to a point where you're resourced. So yeah, I'm very lucky.
Is there any sense that you have to be printing things that their students are producing though? Is it?
No, so we work with the universities in a different way. I work with an editorial committee of about 8 to 10 emerging to mid-career writers and editors. So 6 of them come from the unis. I get 2 from each institution. They help me read all the submissions. They work with me on editing the work for publication. They do proofreading, which is amazing because I often forget where the comma should go. Yeah, so we make sure there's that space for industry development of that next generation of writers and editors with the unis.
And what about hopeful writers? How do they know that you're out there, and how do you solicit?
Yeah, so we do a submissions call out for every issue. I'm sort of playing with whether we'll adjust how we're doing that, because it is a lot of work reading all of them, but also a joy a lot of the time. And that's an open call out to any writers who think that their work speaks to that overarching theme of sort of reality and perception. Yeah, we got hundreds and hundreds for the first issue and have shifted into the thousands for the second issue. So I think people are seeing the call outs.
That is a lot of reading. What would the percentage be? I suppose you could just count it up and look at the issue that you've got here, but what percentage get through?
Oh, it was vanishingly small. I think it was around 2%. Yeah. So I also do some direct commissions. Which I think is important because you want to make sure that you have key issues that are being covered. And, you know, something funny, tip for any writers listening, not a lot of non-fiction pitches as a percentage of submissions. I'd say like 80 to 90% of all our submissions are poetry and fiction, and then a much smaller percentage of non-fiction coming through. So I tend to do direct commissions of non-fiction pieces, a couple just to make sure we've got some bases covered. And then the rest comes from the call out. What
would an example be of non-fiction that you would have your sights on for the next issue, say?
We've commissioned some literary criticism because we had some great literary criticism in the first issue, but we didn't get a huge amount of submissions for that. So we're going to be looking at the working class novel in the next issue, and whether the way people are writing the working class has kept up with the precarity of late stage capitalism, which I think is really interesting. I'm also at the moment in the process of looking to get in contact with a writer in Gaza to get a direct report on their experiences and insights.
It must be a balancing act, because you, at one level, people want literature because it takes them away from the grim reality of what's happening in the world today, but at the same time you need to pull back and connect with the reality as well.
Yeah, I think the thing about a literary journal, which I actually as a reader found hard to reconcile for a while, I would receive these journals in the mail and be sort of immediately overwhelmed by them, but they're a long-term project. Like, we publish once every 6 months, and I do not expect anyone to read the whole 192 pages in a single sitting. It's something to pick up and put down over that whole 6 months, and that's why there's a variety of moods and tones in there, so that there's something to match You know, if you're feeling ready to read about international law in Gaza, we have an essay on that. But at the same time, if you want to just kind of slip into a beautiful ephemeral poem, there's that.
I was talking there to Farrin Foster, editor of Splinter, the new literary journal, next edition out in May. And if that interview has sparked your interest in getting writing and contributing, we'll put details of how you can do that in our show notes. You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for anyone who wouldn't dream of going on holiday without a book or three.
In the last 15 years, I found it really difficult to get into a book. I read a fabulous one about a young woman's experiences on a Greek island. It was a bit of a trashy romance thing, and I loved it. I just read the whole thing in half a day. More recently, which I'm loving dipping in and out of, is Yanis Varoufakis' book on Technofeudalism. And he's just saying everything that we already know, you know, about how our interaction with technology is actually losing the balance, whereas we were leading technology before. Now it's sort of taking advantage of us. Haven't read the whole thing. It's a bit of a dip in and a dip out. So those are the sorts of books that I really like to read, rather than what you see in the Sydney Morning Herald, the good reads of the week. I'm not very good at it. Love going to writers' festivals and hearing people talk. A book that I do remember reading as an adult, probably about 20 years ago, was by Tolstoy. And there was a part of that that described the feeling or the taste of something in your mouth after you'd been starving. So these people had been starving for a long time, and the first thing that they were given to eat after that period of time stayed with the person and had you know, it was a huge sensory input to them. It really affected them. And I remember once when one time we got lost in the Northern Territory. We were trying to get up to the top of some falls, and we had the kids with us, and we were walking forever, and I was so thirsty. And I remember lying down in the creek with my mouth open and the water rushing in, and thinking of that time where that person, I think they were given a bit of some form of cheese, I can't remember, but yeah, it was a powerful image. And something that connects us all as well.
So good to hear the incredible range of what people read, isn't it, Sarah?
Oh, I love it. It just reinforces to me that you don't have to be a specific reader. You don't have to love a novel or literature. You can dip in and out of reading in so many different ways. And so I don't give up on people who say they don't read.
I don't believe them. Anyway, check out Splinter if you want to see what new things people are writing that you can read.
I can't wait to have a look at that, Annie. I'm really, really intrigued.
And that's it for episode 51 of Sundoku.
And don't forget that you can go back anytime and dip into old Sundoku episodes. There's a couple of authors who have featured a couple of times, but mostly we try and plough on and find someone new to speak to and new ideas to speak about each and every episode.
Thanks for your company along the way, and do keep reading. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Sarah Martin. Bye for now.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.